to make it clear.
Order. I did not make the comments.
Bill is not about taking away rights. It is about giving opportunity.
Good, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen Aid, where we wrap the week's current affairs with a panel of bloggers and opinion shapers. Joining me tonight is a former Green Party MP, human rights activist and blogger, Keith Locke, and she is the Labour Party spokesperson for Police and Corrections, MP and high-ranking Jedi Knight, Jacinda Ardern. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, Issue 1, what are to be made of Bob Jones's extraordinarily ignorant and offensive comments on rape? Issue 2, crime rates are down, clever policing or clever massaging of the stats? And Issue 3 this evening, if crime is down, why are we building new private prisons? Plus, we're in the show on a final word, but let's kick things off tonight with Issue 1. On Tuesday this week, the New Zealand Herald decided to publish a jaw-droppingly offensive opinion piece on rape by Bob Jones, where dear old Bob effectively blames women for going out on their own for the rapes perpetrated upon them. These bewildering comments followed on from a judge's bizarre insinuation in a recent court case that found a man not guilty of sexual assault because, in the words of the judge, the jury felt the foolishness of the girls venturing out at night into a park in a strange city, dressed as they were, led to reasonable doubt that they were sexually assaulted. And those comments follow a senior police officer describing a 10-year-old as a willing participant in sex. Jacinda, where to begin here? How damaging are those opinions to society as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, I think, when you go back to the origin of the Bob Jones column, what he was commenting on were a judge speculating over why a jury had not come down on a particular decision. What I would have hoped we would have seen from that judge is said, if that was indeed the reason the jury came to that conclusion, that is utterly unacceptable in the eyes of the law, that any jury, any citizen could say that there is a reason or an excuse for that kind of attack or abuse. And that was, for me, the clincher, the fact that that sentence almost was unfinished in the way it should have been.
Yes, yeah. What do you make of Bob Jones's comments?
Well, I think the thing that shocked me really was this insinuation from him that it's almost like he was saying, yep, it's not okay, brackets, unless you walk in a park alone at night. As a society, we should never accept any excuse for acts of violence against women, because the idea then that they might take upon themselves some kind of fault in what is ultimately an act of violence perpetrated against them. The sad thing is, though, that I wasn't surprised that Bob Jones said that, because he is Bob Jones and he says outrageous things. That's not an excuse for us as a society to give ear to the outrageous things he says.
Keith, where is the responsibility on the behalf of the New Zealand Herald editorial team to have stepped in and stopped this kind of garbage being published?
Well, I'm for freedom of the press, so I don't criticise New Zealand Herald for running the item, and it has generated a good debate. And I think the underlying issue is he says that rape is sort of biological and men commit it and they always will, so just don't walk in dark parks or you'll get done. Whereas you should look at rape as something that is socially ingrained into people, and it's a matter of violence more than sex too. Yeah. And it's a question often people's upbringing, and they're bashed around a lot themselves and then they bash and rape other people. So you've got to deal with that, deal with the problem, which is a social problem, rather than saying, men are going to do it occasionally, women have got to beware, women have got to wear the right clothing not to provoke men, and that sort of reducing everything to a biological urge has got to be combated.
So Bob Jones really is looking for a curfew for women and for them to wear what? Bed sheets when they walk around, just so that we stop any of this.
Yeah, and he's arguing also for a curfew for everyone. You're not allowed to walk through a dark park in case you get bashed up, rather than looking at the problem of crime in society and its social origins. And the social origins are to do with the inequality as well, with Bob Jones, of course, at the very rich end of that inequality. So he doesn't understand it.
No. Jacinda, why Why do you think the focus and energy on telling women not to go out alone at night in case they are raped, but there doesn't seem to be any social narrative at all focused on telling men not to rape?
Yeah, and that's, I think, what caused all of that rage towards that piece, and rightly so. I mean, anyone who's had anyone close to them in their lives who's been the victim of an attack, particularly when it's, you know, late at night and it's a person who's walked through the streets, you do get that sense from them that to some degree they apportion some blame upon themselves. That's just wrong. And, you know, it's so wrong that we need to try and remove that sense that someone should then wear for the rest of their lives both the damage of the attack and the view that somehow they brought it upon themselves, which is just not something we should allow to kind of get any legs. But you're absolutely right. Why aren't we coming back to what is the origins of some of this? And in the latest crime stats, we saw that sexual violence is at an incredibly high rate, the highest we've seen in decades.
Yeah.
We need to start asking why that is and what's going on.
Following Bob's logic, incredibly impeccable logic, I take it if a woman is at home and she leaves her door unlocked and someone breaks into the house and rapes her, that's her responsibility because she didn't lock the door?
Based on his logic, that seems to be it, that somehow everyone has some small fault to play in a crime because they weren't risk averse enough. This is probably the same man who has a problem with risk aversion generally in society.
Probably if you went to his place, you'd find there's a locked gate and walls, and as you find in most rich people's homes these days. So he's probably got that siege mentality himself.
Keith, are we failing to talk to are we failing our sons by not talking to them about rape?
Yes, although it's not just a one-to-one issue, it's something that needs to be discussed more and more openly, and a lot of it is to do with the attitude towards women in society. We still live in a sexist society. It's great to see this young pop star Lord taking on sexism and getting into trouble with some of the other pop stars, but taking it on, and you know that's what we need more of, and being able to, you know, walk down the street, wear what you like, to have the freedoms that everyone, particularly women, should be able to have today.
Do you think more fathers should be having that conversation with their sons, sitting down and talking about consent?
Yeah, that's one of the things. Fathers, uncles, aunts, the family. A lot of it comes back to the whānau, really, that, you know, violence is unacceptable and sexual violence is even more unacceptable, and just create that right role model.
Question to both of you, how do we tackle sexism when it's as entrenched as this?
Oh, yeah. and you know, it's these different layers of it. Some of it in some ways we deal in a more covert way. It's not quite as obvious in places of power anymore as it used to be. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't be battled. On Women's Suffrage Day, for instance, I was the subject of a rather distasteful cartoon, and I don't usually speak out about that kind of stuff because we've also come to a position now where if you speak out about these issues, you're then labelled as some humorist feminist, and so there has to be a balance struck where we're able to have those conversations without the person who raises it being attacked as well.
How do we tackle sexism when it's as entrenched as this?
Well, I think if you go back to a few decades to the rise of the new feminist movement, it was women organised as women that led the path forward. And the more that happens, the more that males and the rest of the society come in behind. So, you know, I just encourage everything towards society, and particularly women's groups. So, you know, fronting these groups.
I've always been a big believer, though, in bringing males with us. They are by far still in the dominant positions of power. Unless we have that collective discussion, then it sometimes can become an insular discussion. We need men to get in behind some of these issues as well.
Final question to both of you. The percentage of sexual assaults that end in a conviction is minuscule. How do we change the judicial system to see justice served in this area?
Yeah, and I think that comes down to some of the practices within the police as well, and that's something I'm keen to talk to them about in my new role. They of course, you know, certainly the police officers I know and have met and talked to want to see resolution in these cases, but often decisions are made by Crown prosecutors as whether or not they can get a conviction, and that determines whether it's pursued. So we've got to do more to resolve that.
Only 1% of sex crimes ever ended in conviction.
Yeah, it's partly that evidentially it's a difficult area with only two parties witnessing. But I think the police could perhaps do more to gather the evidence and present the evidence. I think it shows a weakness there if there isn't that rate of if there's such a low rate of conviction.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with our second issue tonight. The latest crime rates are down, but is that due to clever policing or clever manipulation of crime statistics? Keith, youth court offending and family violence have been removed from these stats, while actual resolution rates of cases has fallen. While sexual assault jumps 10%, these stats are good for insurers, not so good for everyone else, are they?
Yeah, I think overall there has been a drop in crime. With the sexual offending, it's a hard area to dissect because I think with the greater consciousness in society of the wrongness of sexual offending in its various forms, that there is more reporting now, more reporting of family violence, of the man beating up the partner and things like that. So that tends to raise the statistics a bit. But I think it, I would say there is actually a drop looking at overall the figures. And, the youth justice has been a success. The policing since Peter Marshall came in as Commissioner has improved, I think, to a prevention first approach, more community policing, that's helped. And even in the prisons, in terms of stopping reoffending, which is a really big thing and big part of the crime statistics, there has been more of a move in the corrections, and I think Anne Tully, the Minister, has supported it to an extent too, of more rehabilitation programs, a bit more in terms of reintegration into the community once criminals serve their sentence, which is critical, because if they go out they can't get a accommodation, can't get a job. That's a really big issue. There's a long way, a very long way to go to address that in our society, but it's all helping.
Jacinda, police have adopted a more proactive policing strategy as opposed to a reactive one. From a civil rights perspective, though, at what point does proactive policing start to become racial profiling? I mean, how do we guard against that? That's certainly a problem the Metropolitan London Police have had.
Yeah, it is, and actually I worked on a review of policing in England and Wales, and in an interesting way, actually, their attempts to remove racial profiling just led to extra bureaucracy and even more. You do have to be quite careful about that. But I think actually what the police need to do, and this is I know many police officers certainly believe in this, is that policing to be successful has to be policing by consent. At least unless the police have the consent of the community they work in amongst, the whole notion of policing fails. And when you focus on policing by consent, that's actually focused on community-based policing. The idea that actually people report crime to you when they trust you. People will talk about what's going on in their families and the kind of assistance police can give with youth aid issues if they trust you. All of the things actually about successful policing flow out from good relationships with police officers. So if prevention first is actually focused equally on community policing and the idea of getting that consent from the community, that's when it'll be really successful. Do you think
we've got that balance right at the moment?
I think we're moving more towards it. I think more can be done. I think the whole notion of the early the early style of interventionist policing has the potential to be good if done properly, if coupled with the community policing.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why I've opposed the use of tasers or more use of arms is that tends to break down that link between the police and the community. The more the police can present themselves as non-violent in the community and link up with community leaders, then the better it is. I think there has been an advance, and I think it's partly not just to do with the police, it's to do with the communities themselves. I think there's a greater confidence in Māori and Pacifica communities, and Māori and Pacifica are reflected in the overrepresented in the crime statistics, but I think there's more confidence, more relationship to the police, more role models in those communities that's, previously growing up in some of the poorer neighbourhoods, it was very hard to get away from gangs and crime. Now I think it's the community is responding together with the police in a more positive way.
Keith, if these stats are true, a less kind person might suggest poverty, high unemployment and a widening inequality gap are good means of lowering the crime rate. Is that the was that the wrong lesson to take here?
I think the next step is to really deal with social inequality and unemployment and poverty and all of those issues that, as we know, breed crime. Because if you've got nothing to lose, you go robbing houses. That's just what happens. And the way to get around that is to give people a perspective and dealing with things like education's important, because 90% of the people in jail have some literacy problems. They find it harder to engage with the society as a whole, and crime is about not empathising with the victim. And the more you're aware of the whole society, can read and be part of the society, the less likely you are
and
to go down the
50% are
criminal
unemployed.
track.
So absolutely poverty matters, unemployment matters, there's a whole list of things. But globally, crime rates are going down. New Zealand is not alone on this. This is happening across the globe. And actually some people have sat down, economists amongst them, to try and figure out, well, what's the trend? Because actually, has policing necessarily changed in some of these other jurisdictions as we claim it has here? And some will go as far as to claim that it's both the economy. Some even have said it's been the abortion rate.
Freakonomics are pretty big on that.
Some have even claimed it's the decrease in lead in our environment. Some reasonably interesting reading from some environmental scientists in that way. But actually, for me, it all comes back to, well, let's be smarter about crime. If we know what some of the predictors are for someone ending up in jail, instead of saying to the police, it's all up to you, let's start working our social policy around what we're doing to prevent crime.
By removing the youth court and family violence offending from these rates, are we in danger of missing a bigger picture here? I mean, this government have done all they can to not identify child poverty. Are they doing that with violent crime? Yeah,
look, dwelling assaults, absolutely we need to bring those back. We need to have a big picture, a better idea of what's going on. I don't know that has lessened necessarily the activity around family violence and domestic violence. Of course, as a nation, this continues to be a massive problem, but we cannot let it drop off the radar in terms of our statistics.
Final question to both of you. How does a socially progressive country lower its crime rates?
Well, I think the key thing is dealing with the social problems. And one of the other elements that isn't talked about enough is the huge number of convictions for marijuana offences. We're living in a world now where several states in the United States, and Uruguay and Portugal, etc., they're showing that decriminalising or legalising marijuana leads to a reduction in a lot of social harm.
Are we going to see any move in the war on drugs from Labor?
Look, there is a global conversation now that we're not really a part of, that we need to be. I think when people think about crime and when they think about punishment, they think about safety issues. And I think the question we need to ask is, what is really the best way to respond to some of these issues? Is that actually a question of safety for other citizens? And so that's a question for me. But for me, ultimately, when it comes back to, well, how do we reduce some of these rates? Instead of just asking who perpetrated a crime, I think we should ask why. If we start to dig down into some of those layers, I think we're going to be much smarter about the way we tackle it.
Thank you, Jacinda. Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3 tonight. So, if the crime rate is plummeting, why are we putting more people in prison? Why do we have one of the highest incarceration rates in the OECD? And why are we building bloody great big private prisons? Jacinda, $1 billion private prison out at Woody that New Zealand will be contractually bound to pay for all beds, even if they're not full. How has this monstrosity been allowed to happen?
You're never going to get me to justify the existence of private prison provision in New Zealand. I'm against it, both from a practical perspective. I don't think they deliver better outcomes. I don't think the prisons safer as a consequence, particularly not for the guards working in them.
And we found that out recently. The union have done a circulation of a petition within those private prisons.
Absolutely. And
I'm prison guard for 45 prisoners.
Indeed, and that's just not safe on anyone's measure. And they're telling them now that you've got to stay in there regardless of what's going on, because that's the rules. I'm going to visit Mount Eden on Friday. I'm not sure how welcome I will be there. But for me, it's both that practical level, but also, at a principled level, I don't believe that anyone but the state should have the role of taking someone's liberty away, and that's where responsibility should sit. And you see this week when we had these issues with this private prison, as soon as they were raised, the minister said, it's not up to me to comment on this because this is should be dealt with by the contractors. So again, where does the responsibility lie when you start to privatise these issues?
A 30-year contract, we have to pay for every bed in there during that, even if they're not full. Isn't there an incentive then to fill them?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's lots of distortions that come around, you know, when you start creating these kind of monetised incentives then with a private provision. We've been against it all the way through. The only argument that I think around the new Wiri prison that has any that is viable at all is the notion of having prisoners close to family.
Sure,
you know, I do agree with that
yeah,
notion, but the idea of this giant new massive facility that we're now supposed to be excited by the economic gains of,
bizarre.
it's hard to feel good about that.
Keith, overseas the private prison lobby fund victims' rights groups, and they call for harsher and longer sentences to fill their prisons. Doesn't including a profit motive in the incarceration of citizens create a perverse motive to see more people in prison?
Yes, it's a little bit indirect, them getting from victims into the prison, but I think just in the operation of the prisons, if private profit is the governing motive, then you're going to cut corners. You know, that's how you make more money. You know? And the thing about prisons, if you're really concerned with rehabilitation, is you take your time, you provide the courses, you put the extra people in, you spend a lot of one-to-one time with people. All of that isn't going to maximise the profit for the private prison. And they do have measures of efficiency of the private prisons, but it's very hard to measure rehabilitation outcomes because they're not necessarily immediate. You spend a lot of time one-to-one helping a prisoner read. That person might be rehabilitating 2 or 3 years probably they might, but so you can't measure that. But if it's a state-run institution, then you just take the time, you put the extra money in, and the benefit to the community comes back immediately too, because it's $92,000 to keep a prisoner there for a year. If you can rehabilitate that person, and that person isn't one of the ones that bounces back within a year, then you've saved $92,000. The private prisons are working the other way around.
Question to both of you: how do we provide the counselling necessary within prisons to reform prisoners without angering the wider society who are fueled on anger by a crime myopic mainstream media? You've got a lot of people out there very angry, they see the crime stories, they get fired up. You come along and say, well, let's put some more money into counselling. It's very difficult to work that over, isn't it?
I think you've just got to come back to, you know, what outcome do people want to see from our justice system? And yep, certainly people are looking for people to repay their debt to society, but ultimately I think everyone's looking for society and their community to feel safer.
Right.
And ultimately, you know, there are very few prisoners who end up in prison for the rest of their lives. You know, their preventative detention, you know, a few life sentences, those aside, the majority at some point will come out. Now, sure, someone might feel like they've got their retribution side of things dealt with for the period that they're in there. But actually, if we want to make the consequence of our justice system if we want that to be that people are safer, then we will have a focus on what we're doing to rehabilitate, to reintegrate, to change the outcomes. And in that sense, you look at home detention, the reoffending rate off the back of that is something like 20%. Put those same people into prison, it's more like 50%. Overall, it's 70%. So then when you start measuring it in that way, what do people ultimately want? They want people not to offend again.
How do you state that vengeance?
Yeah, well, that's really the fundamental issue, and that's the debate that society has to have with a sensible sentencing trust and those sorts of people, as they see there's a criminal, bash them in terms of long sentences, treat them badly, it's punishment. Whereas good countries like Norway turn it right round the other way. They say the only punishment is you being inside those prison walls and away from your family and community. But we're going to make prison nice for you and give you all these courses and give you as normal a life as possible within the prison walls.
So
and
they
show
to heal them.
heal them. And I think that they provide a model, like Andrus Breivik, the guy who killed, 80 people or whatever, biggest mass murderer ever virtually. They are treating him very fairly.
Yep.
They've led him into a university course. He's doing a university course. They're not punishing him at all within that prison system. The punishment has been in there for a long time, and that's the attitude we should have.
We'll have to wrap the show. Final word, Jacinda, your final word this week.
My final word would have to be on housing this week. On the 10th of October, it is World Homelessness Day. And recently, when in Parliament, I questioned the Minister on his view on homelessness, and he called it a crisis manufactured by the opposition. The fact of the matter is that there are now more families, children, young people homeless than we've seen in quite some time, and we must find responses that are long term and that give those individuals, particularly in Auckland and areas like Christchurch, shelter and safety.
Keith, your final word?
Well, seeing Jacinda's here, I think we're in a new era with the Labour Party, and
Thank God.
I think one of the things that just has to be developed between now and the next election is a good cooperative yet competitive relationship between Labour and the Greens, and talking about them as more or less equal partners. You know, right, the Labour Party might be sort of 2-1 ahead, and that may reflect in the election.
And
but
going up.
will, and I think that means, by partnership, means you don't want to do what Julia Gillard did before the previous election, where she said we are definitely not going to have a carbon tax, even though it was Green policy, and she had to work with the Greens. So Labour shouldn't be too definite on promising on issues where the Greens might have a different stance, because it's going to be a mix, a cooperative mix, the next Labour-Green government, which I think is really on the cards.
Thank you, Jacinda. Thank you, Keith. Ladies and gentlemen, to my final word. So the American government is shut down. Rather than panic, we should be focused on how we can make that permanent. The thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of innocent men, women and children killed by drone strikes would be dancing in the streets at the idea of the US government being shut down. The murderous rampage of state-sanctioned assassinations by the Obama administration in the form of these drone strikes, minus any judicial ramifications whatsoever, is a blight on America. And if they can be paused for one moment by US politicians bickering over the budget, then I, for one, raise a toast to America being shut down for as long as possible. If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded new citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on